In this PowerPoint, you will learn about behavioral views of learning. Behavioral views of learning are divided into two parts, classical conditioning and operant conditioning. The two men on the left are responsible for classical conditioning. They are Pavlov and Watson. The two men on the right are responsible for operant conditioning, and they are Thorndike and Skinner. There are four ways we learn. Habituation, which is a simple form of learning in which an organism eventually stops responding. There are four ways we learn. Habituation, which is a simple form of learning in which an organism eventually stops responding to a stimulus that is repeated over and over. We learn through classical conditioning. An experience creates a paired association, a stimulus-response. We learn through operant conditioning, learning by association. Because we operate in the environment provides rewards and punishments that help us learn. And we learn through observational learning. We learn from watching others. Behaviorism is a theory that explains learning by focusing on external events as the cause of change in observational behaviors. Individuals working with a behavioristic paradigm held certain assumptions. They thought that the environment was key. They believed children were born tabula rasa, a blank slate, and that the environment wrote on that blank slate to cause behaviors. They focused on observable events. They thought that to understand learning, you had to see it. The mind was a black box, and so thoughts, images, fantasies, they didn't want to go there. They didn't want to ask people about those things. They just wanted to observe behaviors. Behaviorists also believed that learning was most likely to take place when stimuli and responses occurred together very closely in time. They called that contiguity. And they also believe that many species of animals, including dogs and pigeons and humans, all learned in similar ways. So this is learning to behaviorists. They thought the environment was out there. What happened in the environment went into that black box, and out came observable behavior. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are two types of behaviorism, classical conditioning and operant conditioning. In this PowerPoint, we're going to address classical conditioning. Take a moment to read the questions on these slides. Can you answer any of them? Now, many of you may have recognized the name Ivan Pavlov and remember his work with dogs. Pavlov classically conditioned dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell. So Pavlov was one of the first individuals to help us understand classical conditioning, which is a form of learning whereby a new involuntary response is acquired as a result of two stimuli being presented at the same time. So with Pavlov, his stimulus was the ringing of the bell, and he was able to elicit a classically conditioned response, the salivation, from his dogs. So what Pavlov taught us was that reflexes can be learned or conditioned through association. By that pairing closely in time of two things, a conditioned response can be elicited. Read these questions and see if you know about John Watson and what he discovered. Watson taught us that humans can be conditioned to fear things. Watson worked with a boy he called Little Albert, and he conditioned Little Albert to fear white fuzzy things. Whenever Albert would reach out for a white fuzzy thing like a rat, Watson would bang a pot, which would cause a loud sound. Eventually, Watson just had to show Albert the white fuzzy thing, and Albert would start to cry because he had been conditioned to fear those types of things. So Watson taught us that humans can be conditioned. Conditioning can cause conditioned illnesses with no physiological basis, aversions, phobias, and post-traumatic stress syndrome. An example of a conditioned response in some of us is when you hear the dentist drill. You get a tight feeling, you get a fearful reaction simply by hearing the dentist drill because you have had the dentist drill paired with that association. It's not even a conscious thing that happens, but when you hear that dentist drill, you feel fear. Watson also taught us that classically conditioned behaviors can generalize or transfer. An individual learns a response to a particular stimulus, like Albert learned to fear white rats, and then makes the same response in the presence of a similar stimuli. Albert was also fearful of white Santa Claus beards simply because the items, the rat and the Santa Claus beard, looked the same to him. He became classically conditioned to fear white fuzzy things. So this has implications for students in your classroom, because the feelings students develop in response to one classroom may generalize to another classroom. So if a child is fearful in Miss Jones's room and then comes to you, that child may still be fearful. So some of what behaviorists have taught us now have neurological connections, and we can make speculations and confirm them based on what we know about the brain. Much of our thinking happens at an unconscious level. Our brain is always processing information. So the behaviorists were right. We do become classically conditioned to situations. So one of the major things the behaviorist who established classical conditioning taught us is that emotions and attitudes, as well as facts and ideas, are learned in school. So think a moment. What will you do if a child in your classroom becomes classically conditioned to fear school, test, or you? Later, you're going to read about a little girl named Abby who has become classically conditioned to fear school.